Okay, so we might get started now. Throughout, if everyone can just keep putting in comments or in experiences that they're having, and we can share those with each other. So I'm just going to let you know a few things before we start. I wanted to thank you all, first of all, for coming along and joining us today. I set up this series of webinars because I too was experiencing that disruption, and I really felt like I was in my own head about everything that was happening. And I felt like this overwhelming urge to do something, and I needed a project. So I started this little webinar project, and about 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I had never done a webinar before. So it was a learning curve for me. I got to, download all the software and then teach myself how to do it. And now I'm full blown into webinars. So I really thank you for all joining us, and we do want it to be as interactive as possible. So if you can just make your comments or ask questions of David as we go, and you can do that in the chat box there. Just for everybody's knowledge, we can't see you or hear you, so you can continue to carry on doing whatever it is that you'd like at your end while listening to David's wonderful presentation. The webinar is being recorded today, and at the end of the webinar, I'll send an email out to all people who registered, and you'll receive a copy of the recording, the slides, and also a list of all of the resources that David has put together for you. So we'll get into the presentation now. A little agenda, but before we get into the agenda, I just want to draw your attention to this disclaimer. I'm a lawyer, so we've always got to have a disclaimer. The content of this webinar reflects the views of the host and the presenter and is provided for informational purposes only. The content does not constitute or substitute professional, medical or legal advice. So our agenda for today, I'm also a mediator, so mediators also always have to have agendas. So you just have to meet my needs about these two things. You'll hear a little bit about me, a little bit about David. We'll hear David's story, which is truly fascinating. And then David is going to walk us through the points here: emotion systems, why disruption is so unsettling, how disruption could potentially be an opportunity for growth. He's going to walk us through some brain focusing practices, some isolation tips, and then he's going to give all of you his top takeaway tips from the presentation. He also has put together a great list of resources, and some contact information will be available in the last slide. So a little bit about me: I'm the Legal Director of Clark & Associates Mediation Services. I'm a lawyer, a nationally accredited mediator, and a family dispute resolution practitioner. Clark & Associates offer mediation services throughout Southeast Queensland in the areas that are listed below here. Our presenter today, Dr. David Rowland. David is a psychologist. He has a PhD in clinical psychology. He's a former forensic psychologist. He's the author of 3 fantastic books, the most recent of which is The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Life Crises, which is very relevant right now. How I Rescued My Brain, a psychologist's remarkable recovery from stroke and trauma. The Confident Performer, and he's the founding member of Compassionate Mind Australia. So, David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks very much for putting this on. I'm sure lots of people appreciate it, and I do myself.
Oh, thank you. We all need a little bit of a project right now, so it's been a little project for you, coping with my type A personality over the last couple of days as well.
Well, type A people get things done.
They do. So we're going to hear about your story today, David. Can you walk our audience through your experiences, please?
Yeah, so just over 10 years ago, I was working as a clinical and forensic psychologist in my private practice, and I've always really loved my work, but there was a period of time around late 2006, 2007 where I was waking up in the mornings and actually not wanting to go to work, and that was very strange for me. I ended up, to cut a long story short, consulting a more senior clinical psychologist because I said, I think something's wrong with me, and I'm even wondering whether hearing trauma stories of 20 plus years is affecting me, because I was having a lot of nightmares. And he eventually diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. And it was a relief to get somebody of his experience to give me a diagnosis like that. It helped me explain what was happening to me. Then the financial crisis hit 2008, and I hadn't been working for 2 years. We'd been living off our savings, and I was the main breadwinner at that time. What resulted was that we were in extreme financial hardship. Never in my life before had I had an inability to just pay every household debt or, find money for food, pay utilities, that sort of thing. And in the middle of that crisis, we had a lawyer who was dealing for us with some of the lenders that were involved in some property that we owned and which we couldn't repay the mortgage repayments on. And he said, I think you're going to go bankrupt. They're going to make you go bankrupt. And that was an incredible stress for me. And it was actually the next day or the second day after he told me that I had a stroke out of the blue. Subsequently, I was sent off to a psychiatric hospital because the stroke wasn't diagnosed in the first instance. I had seen a psychiatrist shortly before because I was going to make a claim with my professional indemnity insurer. And he, once I was hospitalized in the general hospital, said, I think he's suffering psychogenic fugue because I was experiencing a lot of amnesia. I didn't have the normal physical drooping that can often happen in stroke. So they sent me off to a psychiatric hospital. And that first night was really the worst night of my life because I felt a complete failure. I thought I've completely lost it. I've got no control over my mind. And for the first couple of days, I even wondered whether what I was experiencing was real. Was I dreaming it? Maybe it's psychosis, I thought. But subsequently, I realized it was real and I had to adjust to this new normal. But fortunately, one of the psychiatrists in the hospital, suspecting that maybe not all the neurological investigations had been done, ordered a brain MRI. And 3 weeks after my initial hospitalization, that revealed I'd had a stroke. I hadn't suffered psychogenic fugue or a nervous breakdown at all. Well, I actually was very excited to find out that I'd had a stroke because this was an organic condition. And I had a background in neuropsychology. So I actually developed my own rehabilitation program, which involved various forms of brain retraining. And my memoir, How I Rescued My Brain, pretty much documents my story of how I got into that space and then how I got out of the trauma and the brain injury.
Thank you, David. I mean, I think that you're so courageous to be able to tell your story in the way that you do, first of all, because I imagine that it wasn't easy to tell that story at first. So thank you for sharing that. The other thing I want to say is that there are so many lessons, I think, that some of our audience today can take from your story, because we have a number of lawyers and psychologists who are watching. And you and I have spoken a lot about vicarious trauma and how deeply vicarious trauma can affect us if we don't pay very close attention to it. So you've put some resources at the end of our slides today that deal with, in particular, vicarious trauma. And for all those lawyers and psychologists that are watching, I would really say to you that it's important to go and look at those resources and learn more and more about vicarious trauma, because it can become very overwhelming to be in contact with other people's traumatic experiences. And that's certainly your experience when you were a forensic psychologist and clinical psychologist.
Yes.
The other thing that I find so interesting and amazing about your story is that even in this experience that you had of finding and discovering, that you had trauma and then a stroke, you managed to take it upon yourself to rebuild your own brain functioning. And you really did that against medical advice, didn't you?
Well, there was a lack of medical advice. So in the trauma space, post-traumatic stress disorder, there are a lot of good treatments. So I made myself available to those, excuse me. But the brain injury recovery was still a very new field in terms of how much improvement it was generally accepted you could achieve. And you may remember that was around that time that neuroplasticity, the concept of rewiring your brain, just by focusing your attention in different ways, could actually be substantial and create substantial improvement. I was in the very early stage of that, and that's why I did a lot of research, which has now turned out to be, quite conventional. But at that time, it was very new.
Yeah, great. And we're going to hear about some of those practices today. So, David, a lot of us are feeling, really unsettled. I know I personally have over the last couple of weeks. I've had some difficulties getting off to sleep at night. I felt a sort of racing sensation. I felt very much in my own head. I became a little obsessive about looking at the news and seeing what was going on with the virus. And I was trying to teach myself how to cope with all of this new information, because I felt like if I could do that, then I'd stay on top of it. And that sort of really took its toll on me about 2 weeks ago before I started this project. So what's going on there for people, do you think?
I think what you're posing here is a really good thing to investigate, because if we can understand what's happening to us, if we start to make sense of it, it feels like we've got a bit more control, and it also informs us what we can do and what we shouldn't do. So the first thing I'll talk about is the 3 emotion systems. And the first of these is the threat system. And I think we all intuitively understand that we've got an inbuilt hypervigilance system. It's always monitoring our environment, looking out for threats, because that's the basic survival mechanism that we need. That throws up emotions if we're under threat, things like anxiety and fear. And if the threatening situation is prolonged or it seems hopeless, that can create despair, like a loss of hope or a loss of giving up. That's the worst state. In our current pandemic, what we've got is something very unusual. Our threat system is actually designed for acute threat. Like, as they say, the saber-toothed tiger is coming to attack you. You fend it off or you run away. That's the fight-flight response. And some animals will freeze and pretend that they're dead. But that is then over. The tiger is fought off, or you've escaped. But what we've got now is a threat that's ever constant, and it's invisible. And we don't know where we're going to get it or if we're going to get it. We can't see it. So it's this constancy of this threat in our lives. We could go to the supermarket. Suddenly the supermarket is a threatening place. It's a completely unusual situation. We're not actually designed for this type of threat. So that's the threat system. The drive resource seeking system is the one that's also absolutely necessary for survival. This is our drive to find food, find shelter, have sex for reproduction, and also it's our achievement-oriented system. And I particularly want to comment on that here, because what's happened for a lot of people is that their normal work environment or their normal social environment has completely shifted from under them. And so the normal ways in which we might have gained a sense of achievement with the dopamine hits that we get and the highs that we get with each achievement has been taken away for many. All the workers that have lost their jobs completely, where is their achievement coming from? In your case, I know your particular case, you've still got some work on, but you can't do it like you did it before, and it's less work than you had before, and you're working from home where you weren't working from home before. So that's the drive resource seeking system. The third system, did you want to comment, Kate?
Yeah, I just wanted to draw out some of the comments that we've got from our viewers. So some of our viewers are also experiencing, these experiences. We've got a notation here that one person, a lot has changed in their world. They were working full time, but they're trying to now school a child and deal with internet problems. And there's constant interruption that's happening all the time, really missing the quiet time for concentrating on bigger projects. It's hard to find all of that time. And another person has noted that they also have felt quite obsessive and overwhelmed by all of the changes.
Yeah. So we will address some of those issues as we go through, just with the obsession. And I think we've all experienced that. The obsession really comes about because of the threat system and the fact that it's ever present and it's always developing. You know, where's the new threat? So we're not actually getting a period of time where we can calm down and come back to normal before the next threat happens. And so that's why we're becoming obsessive. The third emotional system is the affiliative soothing system. And from an evolutionary point of view, this is a later development. So this only occurs in the mammals, and in the primates, of which we're one. This is particularly a strong system. And it's really evolved from the rest and digest system. So when we're not involved in dealing with threats, when we're not involved in seeking food, shelter, or sex, or achievement of goals, we rest and digest. So sleep is an obvious example of that. And in the primates in particular, the rest and digest system has evolved to become the caregiving system as well. And human beings are the most social or socially connected of all animals. And that's why when we lose a loved one, it really, really hurts. It's like something has been ripped out of us. So what's happening in the current pandemic or crisis is that a lot of our social connection has completely been disrupted. You know, we can't touch, we can't hug, we don't have our normal acquaintances that we see, we don't have our work colleagues that we see, we can't go out and about and just interact with people in a casual way. So our affiliative soothing system has been quite disrupted at the moment. So disruption, the type that we're experiencing now, and the amount of disruption varies for different people and their different situations, is actually dislodging all of these three absolutely basic survival mechanisms. So it's actually quite normal to feel really, really disrupted at the moment.
And I think that social connection element is so true for a lot of people. But I think the other component of that is that, you know, for example, we'll all go away on a short holiday or a 4-week holiday and we're away from our loved ones. So I've been thinking, well, why does this feel so different? You know, I've been away from, for example, my dad for longer. I've been away from my parents-in-law for longer. And the reason I guess it feels so different is because of those additional layers of worry about their health and well-being, worry about the health and well-being of all of our friends, and also not knowing when we can see them again. We don't have that end time.
Yes.
And one of our viewers is saying that they feel like it's because it's forced upon us.
Yeah, it's not something that we've chosen, and we'll comment on that in the next slide.
Okay. And so why is it that disruption is so unsettling? We've got a bit of an idea, but can you sort of break that down a little more for us?
Well, let's take another perspective now about disruption. So as we grow from being a baby and being a child, being a young adult to a mature adult, we're actually building our story, what I call our storied self. And our storied self is just the collection of life experiences that we've had, our interactions with other people and with the world in general, and also how the world works. And so we build this sense of self, which actually we don't know that we're doing. It's like we grow into our skin. We don't know we're growing into our skin, and we grow into our storied self in a similar way. We don't realize that we're doing it, but our storied self is like a container. So what's happening now is that some really basic assumptions about the way the world works is being dislodged, and it's dislodging our sense of storied self. Now we have, whether we realize it or not, we have, for most of us, we have the view that the world is basically benevolent. You know, that life is basically good, and that the people around us are basically good, and that we can trust them, and that things that happen in life are basically predictable. The second fundamental assumption we have is that the world is meaningful. It makes sense. So if I do good things or behave in good ways or moral ways, good things will happen for me. If somebody behaves in less good ways or undeserving ways, we expect that they will get undeserving outcomes. And what we're experiencing now, so that brings up this concept of fairness, that life is fair. And what we're experiencing now that very clearly is that life isn't fair. Why have some people, like those working in the tourism, hospitality, retail sectors suddenly hadn't had their jobs taken away and their livelihoods taken away, whereas others, like supermarket workers, for example, are busier than ever. There's no fairness in that. And so fairness doesn't actually exist in nature. It's a human construct. And we like to see fairness, but when it doesn't happen, so obviously like now, it really dislodges our assumptions about how the way the world works. And also this thing about the story itself is that we generally think that bad things will happen to other people. And when we think about where this virus started in China, in a wildlife animal market in China, how is it that something that happened there through bad animal practices is affecting me here in Australia? There seems to be no logical sort of psychological connection with that. And so we can see that our life assumptions, that if we act well and we do the right things, we won't be harmed, and yet we are being harmed.
Mm. And one of our attendees has said disruption forces us to let go of our idea of control. As you say, you know, we don't have control over these things at all.
And one of the fundamental assumptions we have is that we do control most of the outcomes in our life. So I think it's Rebecca has said that. She's spot on. One of the things that this is showing us, in a good sense, it's waking us up to the idea we actually do not have control over most of the outcomes in our life. We may have some influence, but we've got no control over other people's behavior. And as a more global society that we are now, we've got no control over what happens on the other side of the world, and yet it may affect us. So realizing that we don't actually have a lot of control is actually a good thing to realize, and then work with that. This idea, it's a strange paradox that once I know that I don't actually have a lot of control over most things, that becomes empowering and less dislocating, because when things happen that seem to happen randomly to us, we don't think, oh, I should have controlled that. So what's happening to us now is not our fault. We haven't caused this.
Yeah, okay. And so I was saying to you when we were putting this webinar together that I think that that's the struggle that a lot of people have in the judicial system as well, you know, victims of crime or people involved in family law matters. And we've got a lot of viewers that work in those areas of criminal and family law today, as well as the psychologists who no doubt treat people in those circumstances. And there's that hunt for justice, which is also a construct, isn't it? And justice can't necessarily be achieved in the way that people want it to, just like fairness can't be achieved. And also that realization that people aren't in control of their own environments and that other people can come in and do things to cause disruption to them. And one of our participants has said that always rely on the fact that going to bed every night, that's the only thing I can control, you know, my rest time. And that's a really good point, Emma. And sleep is so important. David's going to get to that now. So how can we try and adjust to all of this disruption?
Well, the first point is that feeling uncomfortable or even distressed at the moment is a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. And so it'll take some period of adjustment, and that period of adjustment will take longer for some, depending on the impact on them, but also the beliefs they have, that story itself, how strong they hold those beliefs that we've been talking about. That will make a difference as well. So the first step is really acceptance. There is a new reality. It's different from the reality we had just a month or 2 months ago. And so it can take some time to accept this new reality. And one of the ways in which we accept this new reality is having chats like we are now and telling our stories. Like, it's impossible to meet somebody currently and not have a virus story of one sort or another. And we can see that as not necessarily being obsessed, but as my way of processing, is this really happening? This happened to me today. What's it like for you? So telling these stories is a way of coming to terms with this new reality.
Mm.
Ultimately, we want to achieve some form of acceptance. Now, the acceptance is provisional acceptance or provisional reality, because we don't know how long this is going to go for. And that in itself is unsettling. If we had an endpoint, a date, and said, oh, after that, everything will get back to normal, we would actually find this easier to deal with. People that are in hostage situations, for example, part of the worst part of that experience is they never know if they're going to be released or when they're going to be released. So we don't have an endpoint. So all we can do in terms of acceptance is say, okay, this is the new reality for now. It seems like it's going to go on for some months, but I will just work with the way things are now and how I view the reality is going to be in the next while. We've already talked about control. Just piece out what is it, what do I have control over and what do I not have control over? And the answer to that second one is that I don't have control over very much at all, except my response to the events that are happening around me. We've talked about the adjustment period, and for some people this will be much longer. For those that have had a huge impact, like lost their whole business or something's completely changed for them, it's going to take longer. They'll be experiencing grief and a sense of loss. Is there anything else there, Kate, you wanted to comment
Well,
on?
yeah, I was just going to say that I think, you know, sometimes when we care about loved ones who have had a blow, we want them to hurry through that adjustment period, don't we? Because we can see the distress on their end and we want them to get to a better place. But actually, that's our own need and not the needs of others. And we need to just be cautious of the fact that that adjustment period is different for everybody.
Yeah. So we want to see that the pain and the suffering that somebody we care about is experiencing is a normal reaction to what's happening, first of all. We want to keep them safe and provide any practical needs or any emotional needs that we can. But then we have to allow them to work through this. There's a struggle here. And the upside of the struggle is that it can, as I said, wake you up and get you to see things that you didn't see before, like seeing that I actually don't have much control. Okay, I need to work with that. So distress can actually become the engine room for growth. And when we see distress as having a positive aspect, then we can allow our loved ones to go through the struggle, see that they're more than the suffering that they're experiencing, and that it won't stay the same, and that they will grow as a person as they work their way through.
Yeah, and I've heard, you know, over the years, a lot of people say, you know, things like, look for the silver lining, or, well, at least you've still got a house, or at least you still have this. Perhaps a reframing of that type of commentary. What could people do rather than, you know, falling into that category of pushing people to see the opportunity?
We've got to be careful, as you say, we don't push people to grow or to go in some direction quicker than they need to. You know, if we think about grief, for example, somebody's lost a child, which is probably the worst type of grief, or a partner or a parent, we don't expect people to move through that quickly. And we also recognize that people have individual ways of moving through that. So what we're really doing is walking alongside them or being a companion with them as they go through that experience. So we just know if we're helping somebody else who's going through this disruption and they're suffering a lot, we can make suggestions that or offer different perspectives, but we don't want to be pushing them. We want them to lead the way because it's their struggle that they need to go through.
Okay, that's great advice. And so some tips for us on managing disruption. Can you walk us through how we can do that, having regard to what it is that disruption actually means for us?
Well, now we're getting to sort of more the practical side of things. So we understand that the threat system is continually being stimulated by the current type of crisis that we're in. So one of the things that we can do is define what the actual threats are. because there's a lot of emotional contagion going on here. You know, all that panic buying, it's just pure emotional contagion. Somebody else is getting panicky, so that panic becomes infectious.
Mm.
So there's a lot of emotional contagion going on, as well as the actual virus itself. So we want to actually...
We now can't get toilet paper, so that's now a real, a real issue.
Someone reminded me that during the Depression, people used to use their telephone books, but we don't have telephone books.
Oh.
Anyway, we define the threats, and for some people that will be financial threats and you know, other really basic threats. So they need to define what it is and what's within their power to do something about that. And you may not be able to fix those things up straight away. I learned that when I went through my crisis and the effects of the global financial crisis. You just could not deal with all of those financial threats straight away. So define the threats and also ask, what's the worst that could happen? As far as I can see realistically, what's the worst that can happen? And if that happened, how would I deal with that? And sometimes that's very reassuring, because you think, well, I could deal with that, or I could find ways around that. The second thing with the drive resource system is we're now in this new reality, and everybody's new reality is different. So let's say, okay, within this current new reality, are there some new types of goals that I can set? So it may not be, some people continue to work like they did before, but they're just doing it remotely. So for them, this is less of an issue. However, for those for whom their work environment or their social environment's changed, they might want to create some new goals. So what are some new things that I can do? Now, where I'm living here, we've had people renovating on both sides. So they're taking their time to do renovations. Some people are doing other household jobs that they've always meant to get round to. For myself, I'm looking to take up my Spanish language lessons again, which I dropped some time ago. So what are some new things that I can do in the current environment?
For me, that's become I'm now a school teacher for my 3-year-old who's at home with me. So I'm doing lesson planning every night, which is pretty interesting, and trying to find science experiments that I can make out of household goods.
Yes.
And I'm also doing this webinar, and I'm exercising more, which I'm finding really useful. We'd be interested to hear, I'm sure, what our other participants have been doing, looking for some new things. So go on, David, while we wait to hear from other people.
Yeah. And the third system, the affiliative soothing system, as we've already commented, you know, our normal social connection has been disrupted, but yet people are finding innovative ways of still socially connecting. Like, I'm an ocean swimmer, so this morning I went down to the beach. Our beaches are still open. I went for my swim, but pretty much all we can do now with the other swimmers is say hello and, you know, and goodbye. So it does feel very strange, but it's still actually nice to see them or to see them walking up along the beach. The other things that we can do is start being grateful for the things that we do have. And there's an exercise called the gratitude journal, where I just write down some things that I'm grateful that have happened today, or things that I realize I've got in my life that are still good. Like, I've still got my health, my family is still well, you know, I have shelter, I have food, it's a beautiful day, those sorts of things. And then there's some self-soothing things that we want to do. Unfortunately, touch, because it's important, touch and social connection are as important as breathing, really, for humans. And the current situation means that touch and that social connection face-to-face is much more difficult. So I've added an exercise for self-soothing, which includes various forms of touch, actual touch that we can do that helps to ease our sense of anxiety.
And there are probably a few people who are watching who are by themselves. So, you know, they're not going to be able to have that physical contact with others. So that could be a really helpful exercise.
Yes.
And some of our attendees are saying that they've been going for a walk every morning, and they haven't done that before. Another attendee is now teacher to 3 children. My goodness, you'll need to have some excellent self-care practices to manage all of that, and they're increasing their exercise, so that's good. We have another person who is having an exchange at the dinner table every night, which is quite nice, and conversations and trying to focus on positive things.
And I think it's Jill who's at the dinner table with the family and focusing on things that they're grateful for. One of the positive psychology exercises is 3 good things that happened for me today. And they can be the smallest things, you know, like I woke up and I felt I had a nice dream, or, you know, somebody said something nice to me. So that reminding those, you can have those conversations just with yourself or in writing, or with people that you're living with or you can talk with.
And we have one more comment here, trying to create some more content to share with colleagues and interact with other professionals in other ways. And also Scrabble. Oh, Scrabble. I've played Scrabble for a long time. Yes, Deb. And meditating before sleep. Oh, Deb, you should be running a webinar on self-care. That's fantastic. Okay, so now this is the thing that I'm really excited about, because I think you're truly an expert in this area, David. So brain focusing practices. How do I stop my brain from going absolutely berserk? How do I calm everything down, slow everything down? Because I have had, you know, that sensation of racing thoughts, especially just before bed. And I think that was a lot to do with watching those prime ministerial updates about what all the new restrictions are, which was far too close to my bedtime. So I've stopped doing that now.
Yes.
But what else can I do? Please help.
I guess the key message really is that we can change the focus of our attention. So if we think of our attention as being like a beam of light, and it illuminates what we focus on. And there we start to make decisions about what is it good to focus on and what is it not good to focus on. So you've already highlighted that it's actually good not to focus on a lot of the news at the moment. Sure, we need to know what the guidelines are, but beyond that, as we said, we've got very little control over everything, so we don't need to know everything that's happening. So with neuroplasticity, what that means is that I'll form new neural connections with the existing connections in my brain by the way I focus my attention. And one of the things that we can do is activate our left prefrontal cortex, which is the meaning-making part of the brain. That's the brain that starts to make sense of life experiences that we're having. And lawyers in particular are very highly trained in that sort of left prefrontal type of focusing. But here we want to do it for ourselves. So one of the ways I found that I could activate that part of my brain was writing a narrative. So I actually went over my life story and wrote, you know, episodes from my life experiences, because I was wondering, why had these things happened to me? Was I to blame in some way? Had I made bad decisions? In the end, I came to the conclusion that I'd made good decisions with what I knew along the way. So people can start to journal, and you can just journal what's happened the day before. I used to journal after I'd meditate in the morning, and I'd write about the experiences I'd had the day before. And that would help release some of those thoughts and some of those worries and put them on the paper. The second type of thing we've talked about is soothing techniques. And we've talked about touch, for example, warm baths, having a bit of weight on us when we lie down. They increase the vagus nerve response. They increase vagal nerve tone, which is that type of tone we want to activate when we want to ease. Now, you mentioned, or a few people have mentioned meditation, but I want to comment on mindfulness first. Mindfulness is a way of just noticing what's happening within us, whether it's our thoughts, our feelings, or our bodily reactions. And we can't choose to make wise decisions about what's good for us and what's not good for us unless we've got some introspective mindfulness. And so in the resources, I've put some mindfulness practices there. And mindfulness is not easy. So this is something we need to practice. And what neuroplasticity shows us is that the things that we practice are the things that become the default option. They become eventually easier
And that's what happens for people that are suffering from trauma, isn't it? They lay down those neural pathways to fear and anxiety as a result of their trauma. And that's why they often have those continuous responses. And so it's almost a rebuilding of where the preferred neural pathway is.
And, you know, in a simple way, a couple of the strategies we can use is that just be more mindful. That is, focus your attention on what you're doing right now. So if I'm gardening, I know I'm gardening. If I'm washing the dishes, I know I'm washing the dishes. If I'm eating, I know I'm eating. And one of the mindfulness meditation techniques that was really valuable for me when I was experiencing a lot of panic attacks was walking meditation. And what this does is physically bring myself into the body, and I found it very soothing. So I would just take slow steps that would coordinate with my breathing. I'd feel the pressure of the soles of my feet on the earth. I'd feel the movement of my feet and legs through the air. And when I was really distressed, that was the one thing that really could help bring me back. Meditation itself is another skill or another technique, and it's something you need to practice, and is beyond our webinar today.
I must admit that I find meditation very tricky.
Yeah.
I find it very hard to slow down in that way, and then I get cranky with myself that I'm not good at meditating, and I don't like not being good at something. So you say that that's normal and I just need to keep practicing it.
Well, you need to keep practicing these things or find a way of doing it. So for example, swimming, I think, is a form of mindfulness meditation. If you just really connect with your breathing, you connect with the rhythm of your arms and the movement of your body, that's a form of mindfulness meditation, because it's bringing you into your body and it's starting to let go of the external. The other thing you can do, for example, is find a sit spot. If you've got a garden or a balcony where you can see some nature, or you can just see peaceful goings on, a sit spot is just where you sit and you just contemplate and just take in whatever's happening without needing anything to happen in particular, without you needing to achieve anything in particular. So you're just finding a regular sit spot. And if you do that daily, you start to notice the progression, how things change from day to day. And that can become a form of contemplation.
And we've got a comment here that yoga is very helpful. And I agree with that. I'm a pretty traditional type A personality, so I need to be in a state of constant achievement. Yeah. So the only yoga I found useful is a yoga practice called Bikram yoga, which is in a hot room, heated to 40+ degrees. And so the extreme of that is the only place that I can really do mindfulness and meditation, mostly because I think I'm in pain most of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and fortunately, a lot of yoga teachers are putting their classes online and their yoga sessions on YouTube already.
And I've got a great tip for Jill, actually. There's a really great kids yoga called Cosmic Kids Yoga, and you can look that up on the internet, and they've got free daily yoga classes for children. And I've been doing that with my 3-year-old every afternoon. So I've been finding that helpful. Yeah. And the other tip you had, which I think is so relevant for our type A personalities, is goal setting.
Yeah. So because we still want to achieve things, we still want to create goals, but we just need to create new types of goals. So we create goals for this period of provisional existence where we don't know it's going to end. So how this new reality is, create some goals for that. But we can still have long-term goals. So if they might be professional development or skills, like you've learned how to do webinars, which is going to be useful at some point down the track for your profession or your occupation, so that we could do some professional development or learn some new techniques, which are going to be useful for when we get back to work. And I might just give an example of a friend of mine who runs an art gallery, which of course is now closed, but she foresaw that they were going to close. So her and her partner did some videos of all their artworks and then had an online sale, and they sold more artworks than they do normally when people could come into the gallery. But now she's closed the gallery. The landlord's given her 2-month rent freeze. And so she's going to use that time to set the gallery up as a teaching space. So she would rather teach art rather than sell art. So she's created an opportunity there, which she couldn't have done otherwise.
I think that's fantastic. And, you know, for me also, I found that opportunity in that I have learned this new skill of webinars, and I'm connecting with a lot more people through LinkedIn and through other resources. We've got some other comments here. Some people are talking about their different mindfulness strategies. And we have one example where you have to sit for 30 minutes eating 2 sultanas and just taking time to experience everything from feeling and smelling the sultana to then feeling it in your mouth. I don't think I have the patience for that, but that's a really good idea. So this is really important for us all now, David, isolation tips. And I'm hearing a lot of mixed reports about how long we're in isolation for. It could be a month, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, who knows? But we're all going to have to adjust, aren't we? What can we do?
What we really like as people or as human beings is routine and structure. So as we've already talked about, a lot of that's been disrupted. Like you've told me already that your husband is still doing his normal work, but he's just able to do that at home. So the adjustment for him has not been as huge as for some people. Like, for example, me, all my speaking engagements with the release of a new book have all been cancelled or postponed. So all this work that I had thought was coming up is now disappeared. Although I just found out yesterday that some of the festivals which are cancelled are now looking to do digital online festivals. So that could be a real possibility. So we want to create structure and routine with this current new reality while not being sure how long it's going to last. And one of the things we can do is have zones of isolation, even within our household. Like we have zones of isolation. We go somewhere for work or we go somewhere to do exercise. So as much as possible, create spaces where you do that particular thing in your current home environment. The other thing that we have is probably more time because we're not commuting or traveling as much. So there's some things that we can do which actually will bring pleasure in this new environment. And so I've just used the example of cooking and eating. So here's an opportunity to do more home cooking, try out new recipes, learn some new skills with cooking. And the third one is exercise. We still know that that's absolutely essential. And some of that we can do at home, but we're allowed to go out for a bike ride or a walk or a swim or whatever it is you're able to do in your particular environment. The next one I want to comment on is alone time. When we've got routine, we actually structure our day, and there's periods of time where we think, oh, it might be just the drive home or the walk home. We've got time just to mull over whatever's happening. So we still want to have alone time. So can we still structure our day, even if maybe we're a family in one household, where I have some alone time? And for some of us, that will be meditation or some sort of exercise. We've already touched on monitoring how the stimulation or the potential threat, how much we allow that into our mental real estate. And for most of us, we want to control that. So I'm having some days where I don't watch the news at all or keep up to date, because if there's something really important, I'm sure I'm going to learn about it. And for most of us, once we've got things established and things have sort of settled down a bit, we don't actually need to keep on top of everything that's happening in the world. Some people have told me they're cleaning out things that they've always meant to clean out and discovering things they've forgotten about. So there's all those sort of household jobs that you might be doing. And then finally, of course, we want to maintain social connection. So that can be telephone calls, that can be everybody's on Zoom at the moment or Skype. And as I said, even with my ocean swimming, I can still wave or talk at a distance for brief periods of time with some of my fellow swimmers. And I like that. I get a lift from that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that social connection, we really do need to look for those ways where we can still try and get a visual of people, or even a voice from people, because if we're always just texting and emailing, we're losing that huge component of non-verbal communication. And we're also not able to check for distress in other people, which, you know, is really important to look out for.
Yeah, it's been shown that we feel most connected when we're face to face with other people. And then the second level would be, as we're doing now, you know, via video. And the third level would be a telephone call where we're hearing the person's voice and it's interactive. But as you said, texts and emails, it's less a sense of connection, but it's still a form of connection.
Yeah, great. And so your top tips for all of our viewers?
Well, the first one, of course, is to accept reality, this new reality, and just say, okay, this is how it is for now. I don't know how long it's going to go, but okay, let me work with this new reality. It's not a time in this early stage to be searching for meaning or why it's happened. It's sort of irrelevant, really, to us individually. It's irrelevant for those people that are making important decisions, of course. We're not to blame for what's happened. We didn't bring this upon ourselves. Creating new routines. I really encourage creating new routines. It may take a while to work those out. And, you know, as I said, some yoga teachers are putting their things online. I like to do at least 1 or 2 yoga classes a week if I can. But my favorite yoga teachers aren't online yet, so I'm just finding other ways of doing that. Now, there's an opportunity as we settle down to see that there could be new opportunities here. One of the things that's happening is it might wake us up to the fact that the way I was living or working before actually isn't how I want to do that. I want to make some changes. For some people, that might be a complete change, certainly if they've lost their whole livelihood or business and they can't go back to how it was before. But there could actually be some new opportunities here, and you may not see them straight away. The other thing we talked about, particularly with the brain retraining, is not just focus on what you've lost or the negative side of things, but start to focus on the positives. We talked about gratitude, and inculcating gratitude actually trains our brain to savor more the things that are good in our lives. And to remind ourselves that this is not going to last. It is a provisional experience, but we don't know how long it's going to be, but we can be pretty confident it's not going to last and it won't stay this way forever. And then finally, with each day, or even sometimes each hour, do what you can and then allow yourself to rest. So each day I'll do something that helps me move forward or helps me adjust or helps me come to terms with the new reality, and then I can let it go. I can't solve everything straight away.
That's really good advice. And so, David, there's some amazing resources we've put here. I just want to draw everyone's attention to those first phone numbers that are listed. Those phone numbers are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we've got Law Care, Lifeline, and Beyond Blue. Tell all of your friends and family about those phone numbers as well. Then David has listed some amazing resources for us. The first is a link to his book, The Power of Suffering, which is a great read. I really recommend everybody to go and buy 17 copies and send it to all of their family and friends. Mindfulness and meditation links. We've got that self-soothing practice that you were talking about earlier, the compassion practice, writing to heal, and those links about vicarious trauma, as well as a poetry and wisdom podcast. And if anyone would like to get in contact with either David or I, our contact details are there. We've still got plenty of time for questions, and there are a couple of comments that I haven't gotten to yet, but I'm just noticing the time and noticing that some people might have to go. So if you do need to go, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you to our presenter, David. But if you would like to stay, you can make some comments or ask some questions. So here's a little note for you, David. We've got a comment that although this person thinks that they're not the only one. They're experiencing that they're having some bickering going on in their household with their loved ones. For example, putting the dishes away, how clothes are put on coat hangers. I'm going to guess that this person is a type A personality like me, because I also experience these issues. So any ideas on how we can just sort of get through that bickering stage and what we can do to try and deal with that?
Well, without knowing the personal circumstances, of course, I can only make some general comments. One is to recognize that this certainly has stresses that didn't exist before, like we're living on top of one another if we're with partners or family. But really, I would suggest making a family plan, working out who does what and when it happens, and any grievances that people might have, or anything that's particularly important to you that the family recognizes that you do. So actually working out a family plan, like you might, if you were in the workspace or you're involved in some organization that, followed an interest of yours, actually work out who does what, how you do it, how you bring up grievances or make suggestions, that sort of thing. It really does need to be negotiated.
And I often suggest to people in a mediation setting that in moments where there's bickering over things, to let the other person know what the priority of that issue is to be resolved. So giving a sort of scale, number, so 0 being the lowest and 10 being the highest. And so if the dishes are a 10 issue, you need to discuss that together in a standalone conversation within the next sort of 12-hour period. But, in doing that exercise, I think we often do a little bit of self-checking and we realize, look, actually, this is only a 2. And then I think when you realize it's a level 2 issue, sometimes you're even willing to let it go. So that can be a really helpful tip. And the other thing I say to people is, try and have conversations about those moments of frustration after you've de-escalated your own emotions a little bit. Take a little walk away from the dishes. Don't be so quick to react all the time. And going through that process of what is the priority of this issue can just help you just have a breather before then going to your partner or your loved one and saying, look, I have a type 6 category issue that I need to talk with you about. Can we please talk about the dishes, because it's really becoming a problem for me? And it's that old saying, choosing your battles, I guess. But sometimes when we're living on top of each other, those battles become, quite imperative to deal with, because it's our only experience and it's our environment that we're living within.
And that's where the alone time and getting out and doing some exercise would really help as well.
And so Stephen says that he thinks that we're going to be dealing with all of this for about 12 to 18 months, and we will not go back to how things used to be. It's quite distressing to think of it in that way. But I think a lot of things will go back to a sense of normality, if we can use the word normality. But I think you're right, Stephen. I think that there will be changes. And even yesterday, I was saying to David, I personally have felt a change within myself about hygiene practices and about my attitude towards health. Previously, if I had a common cold or even, another issue, I wouldn't have thought twice about going to the grocery store or going out and doing things. And now I've realized that that was incredibly selfish of me. I shouldn't have been, putting myself out there around other people, potentially making them sick. But as a lawyer in particular, I've always been trained that we just have to keep carrying on. So I always put my own health on the back burner. But actually what I didn't realize is I'm also putting other people's health at risk by behaving in that way. So I've had a shift, and I think those shifts will continue to sort of flow in our society.
I actually think some really good things could come out of this. I mean, on a personal level, I know that when you lose something, and you're able to get it back, or some version of that back, you appreciate that a lot more. You value it a lot more. And one of the things that we're losing now is the normal social interactions. And so we start to realize how valuable they are, how much we need social connection and interaction. And also one of the things that's happening is that nations around the world are all having to deal with this conflict or this crisis. And we need all nations around the world to deal with climate change. We need a coordinated effort. So if they can start to coordinate and help one another with this pandemic, then there's already a platform, if you like, or an idea that we could do that with climate change. And maybe the virus is a way of telling us we can't keep living the way we have. We do need to reevaluate our lives, not just on a personal level, but on a society, national level, and global level. I think some good things are going to come from this.
Oh, I hope that that's true. And, you know, the other component of all of this, and I get quite emotional when I see this sort of imagery, but, you know, those beautiful stories that keep emerging, which do restore our faith in humanity, you know, people on top of rooftops or you know, in their windows in Italy singing songs together as a community. It actually, I find that quite upsetting because I think that that's all very beautiful, and all of that humanity that we're starting to experience is a huge positive, I think, as well. But David, I hope you're right about our global sort of mindset shift in relation to climate change. I think you're right. I think previously we really had that in the too hard basket, and that perhaps now we're all seeing that global cooperation is really possible in the right circumstances and when it's important. And this virus has been important, and climate change and taking note of that and making changes is important as well.
Yeah, so there's lots of growth opportunities here for us on an individual level and on a bigger level as well. I'm actually absolutely confident of that.
That's a really nice note to end on, I think. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And as I said at the beginning, I'll be making a copy of this recording available to everyone. You'll get a copy of the Dropbox link. Now, in the weeks to come, we've got some really fantastic presentations. Next week, we have a nutritionist who's going to be giving us some really helpful advice about how we can look after our nutrition during isolation. I sent Ange a list of really tricky questions, like how we possibly shop for 2 weeks at a time and what sort of food we can really be eating. And I said to her, look, all I want to eat is chocolate cake and chips right now because I'm feeling some emotions, but she's going to give us some tips on how to really deal with those types of problems as well, that emotional eating. And then the week after that, we have a leadership expert who's going to be talking about how we can lead people through difficult times. And we also then have a child expert who's going to be talking about how we can really support children during the disruption period. And those presentations are going to be really, really helpful. So look out for those and register for each of those events. And David, thank you so much. I'm so glad that I met you, and I'm really thankful for your time today. I'm sure everybody is.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to everybody that joined us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.